Hello everybody, this is David. Welcome back to my channel. This is the next in our series, Where did the Bible come from? How did we get the Bible? And we're going to begin a look at, in this video, what's known as canonicity. That is the determination and discovering of the God-inspired books. How do we work out which book belongs in the Bible, in other words? So I'm just going to do an introduction to canonicity, then we're going to have a look at a particular aspect. So the significance of canonicity, or why it's important, is if the scriptures are indeed inspired by God, then a big question arises. Which books are inspired? Now, historically, it was important for the people of God to decide which books, or work out which books God had inspired and which ones were recognized as authoritative. So there is a difference between inspiration and canonicity, as Dr. Norman Geisler and William Nick say in their book, Introduction to the Bible. Inspiration indicates how the Bible received its authority, whereas canonization tells how the Bible received its acceptance. It is one thing for God to give the scriptures their authority, and quite another for men to recognize that authority. So let's have a look at what does canon mean. The canon of scripture, as it's often called. What does canon mean? Well, the original meaning is can be traced to the ancient Greeks, who used the term in a literal sense. To them, a canon was a rod, ruler, staff, or measuring rod. Now, canon is spelled C-A-N-O-N, different from cannon, C-A-N-N-O-N, which is a weapon of war. So we're talking about canon, 5 letters. So the Greek word for canon, it is rod, ruler, staff, or measuring rod. It was a standard for measurement. The literal meaning provided the basis for a later extended use of the term, and the word eventually was extended to mean a rule or standard for anything. So a canon, C-A-N-O-N, is a standard for just about anything now. But in regard to the Bible, in theological usage, canon refers to authoritative scripture. As F.F. Bruce says, who was a British theologian, he said, and I quote, "When we speak of the canon of scripture, the word canon has a simple meaning. It means the list of books contained in scripture, or the Bible, the list of books recognized as worthy to be included in the sacred writings of a worshipping community. In a Christian context, we might define the word as the list of the writings acknowledged by the church as the documents of the divine revelation." End of quote. And that's in his book, from his book, The Canon of Scripture. So the usage in the early church, the term canon references to the books of scripture, was developed with the early church fathers. And again, F.F. Bruce says the first clear application of this term to the scriptures is attributed to a man called Athanasius in AD 367. So let's have a little look now at how do we determine the canon. Who or what determined or decided or worked out which books were canonical? So firstly, God determines the canon. Canonicity is determined by God. A God is a book is not inspired because men made it canonical. It is canonical because God inspired it. Thus, canonicity is determined by inspiration. So, secondly, there's a distinction between determination, how we work it out, and discovery. So, understanding canonicity involves two related but separate issues. Firstly, canonicity is determined by God, and secondly, canonicity is discovered by man. So, a failure to keep this distinction leads to confusion. How a book received its authority is determined by God. How men discover and recognize that authority is another matter altogether. Now, before we go on to have a look at the canon of Scripture, I want to have a look at some false views concerning canonicity. So the first false view is that old age determines canonicity. Canonicity is not determined by the antiquity or age of a book. This view was held by J.G. Eichhorn in 1780. He believed that all books composed after Malachi's time were excluded from consideration. In other words, he believed that all Jewish books before Malachi were considered canonical. Now, there are many books that are older than some of the books of the Bible that are not considered canon. I'm going to mention three. For example, the book of Jasher, which is mentioned in the book of Joshua chapter 10 verse 13. Secondly, the book of the wars of the Lord, which is mentioned in Numbers chapter 21 verse 14. And thirdly, the books of the Jewish Apocrypha. So another false view, part more to do with that, is that many of the canonical books were received into the canon shortly after they were written. Moses' writings were considered as authoritative while he was still living, as we read in Deuteronomy chapter 31 verses 24 to 26, and Daniel accepted Jeremiah's book as canonical, as we read in Daniel chapter 9 verse 2. And Peter considered Paul's letter to be scripture, as we read in 2 Peter chapter 3 verses 15 and 16. So the second false view is that Hebrew language determines canonicity. Now, Hitzig, who lived around 1850, believed the use of the Hebrew language was the Jewish test for canonicity. However, books such as Ecclesiastes, Tobit, and 1 Maccabees were rejected even though they were composed in Hebrew, which if we have a look at Gleason L. Archer's book, who was an American theologian who lived between 1916 and 2004, he did a book called The Survey of Old Testament Introduction. We can get that information from there. So the third false view is that agreement with the Torah or the law determines canonicity. The Torah, though it is not the standard of canonicity, though all canonical books will agree with the Torah, plus Jewish fathers believe their Talmud and Midrash agreed with the Torah, but they were never believed to be canonical. The fourth false view is that religious value determines canonicity. The very fact that a book is canonical guarantees that it will have religious value, but religious value does not necessarily make a book canonical. Many books with religious value have been written that have not been accepted into the Bible. So the fifth false view is the church determines canonicity. Now this is often associated with Roman Catholicism. Now, according to this view, the church determines the canonicity of the books of the Bible. A book is canonical because the Church declares it to be so. Now, it must be noted that since the Roman Catholic Church sees itself as the determiner of the canon, it sees itself as having an authority to interpret the books of the canon that others do not have. Now, the following points, however, argue against this view. First one is that God determines whether a book is inspired and thus canonical. Churches and councils do not. Men do not determine which books are canonical. God does. God gives the books of the Bible their divine authority. God's people recognize this authority, but they do not determine its authority. As J.I. Packer said in his book, God Speaks to Man, the Church no more gave us the New Testament canon than Sir Isaac Newton gave us the force of gravity. What a great quote that is. So, and again, secondly, canon determined immediately. Well, let's have a look at this. The books of the Bible became canon the moment they were written. They did not need to wait for the Church's sanction to become canon. They were canon the moment they were written. So, thirdly, this view confuses the two related but separate issues. Number one, the canon's nature, or the determination or the working out of it. And secondly, the canon's discovery. James White, who is an American theologian, wrote in his book, The Roman Catholic Controversy, he rightly points out how some people confuse the nature of the canon with how people come to know the contents of the canon. And he uses this example to illustrate this, and I quote, "I have written 8 books. The action of my writing those books creates the canon of my works. If a friend of mine does not have accurate or full knowledge of how many books I have written, does that mean there is no canon of my books? No, of course not. In fact, if I was the only one who knew how many books I had written, would that mean that the canon of my books does not exist? The point is clear. The canon is one issue, and it comes from God's action of inspiring the scriptures. Our knowledge of the canon is another. Our knowledge can grow and mature as it did in times of history, but the canon is not defined by us, nor is it affected by our knowledge or ignorance." And he wrote that in his book, The Roman Catholic Controversy. End of quote. So, there are a few false views on how a book is decided, the canonicity. Does it belong in the Bible or not? So, I want to thank you for joining me in this video. Our next video will be how the Old Testament canon was developed, how the Old Testament books were truly canonical books. So thank you very much for joining me. See you on the next video. Bye bye.